Hey there! Do you ever wish you could just start over? Put all of the mistakes of the past behind you and begin again with a clean slate? I'm here to tell you that you can, thanks to a formula carefully brewed in modern labs around the world. It's called Blue-Red Taking Turns, and it's pure magic. With just a few doses of time warps and temporal masteries, you too can experience the joy of starting over again, and again, and again, until victory is finally yours. But taking turns isn't for everyone. It's for those players who delight in the agony of others. For the people so fundamentally evil that they realize the best way to counter all of their opponent's spells is to never give them the chance to cast any. Or for those of us who love magic so much, we want to play all of it. Taking turns players are like the reverse Oprahs of magic. You get no turns, and you get no turns, and you get no turns. I also love turns because it's one of the most fundamentally blue decks I've ever played. Maybe I'll counter some spells, but it's not in the business of removing your opponent's permanents or having many of its own. It just wants to keep drawing cards until the inevitable heat death of the universe. Taking turns is also a deck that rewards putting in a lot of practice and being familiar with the modern metagame. And while Taking Turns struggles against hyper-aggressive decks, it has favorable matchups against mid-range decks like Jund, Abzan, Valakut or Primeval Titan decks, and Eldrazi Tron. Because Taking Turns has so many ways to draw cards, it's fairly resilient against hand disruption like Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek. And nothing feels better than screwing over someone who was trying to screw over you. Eventually, you lock your opponent out of the game by never letting them have another turn. There's more than one way to build a Taking Turns deck, but I'm the captain of this internet ship. So today we're looking at my current preferred way to build. While I originally started playing a mono-blue version of Taking Turns, I've shifted to blue-red for access to Pyroclasm and Blood Moon out of the sideboard, because I felt that these two cards helped shore up otherwise bad matchups. But if you want to take out those pesky and expensive fetch lands and throw in some more islands, I think you're still going to have a great deck. Just remember to take the red cards out of the sideboard if you do that. Taking Turns' objective is to stay alive long enough to eventually start chaining together extra turn effects. There are a few key categories of cards that get this done: card draw, extra turns, counter magic, and other stuff. While the name of the deck suggests that the extra turn spells are the most important, that's actually not entirely true. The key to chaining together extra turns effects is drawing cards. A lot of cards. I drew an extra card off this cryptic command. More than that, and an extra one off this remand? I have a fever and the only cure is more card draw. To draw cards, we first have 4 Dictative Crucifix, a Theros-era enchantment that says that each player draws an additional card at the beginning of their draw step. This is what's known as a Howling Mine effect, after the artifact that originally introduced it. Though Dictative Crucifix costs 1 more than the original Howling Mine, I prefer it because it has flash. This means that you get to be the first player to draw an extra card off the enchantment. It also gives you more flexibility to hold up counter magic during your opponent's turn, and in Jazzercise and in Magic, flexibility is key. The more things you can do on your opponent's turn rather than your own, the better. Next, we have 4 copies of Ancestral Vision. Ancestral recalls younger, less hot sibling that was unbanned in Modern just last year. But just because it doesn't live up to the original doesn't mean that this isn't one heck of a sexy spell. I mean, it says draw 3 cards. Ancestral Vision loves me. Ancestral Vision loves me not. This is a pick that is a little controversial, as some Turns players prefer Howling Mines over Ancestral Visions because it will consistently give you an extra card every turn. I prefer Ancestral Vision, however, because it gives us more cards to potentially play on turn 1, and getting your game plan online from the first turn of the game is an effective way to put yourself ahead of your opponent. If you're on the play, it also gets around discard like Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek. In games where you're relying a little more heavily on cryptic commands and exhaustions to keep your opponent from killing you, Ancestral Vision doesn't give your opponents more cards, and therefore more ways to potentially weasel out a win. And while it doesn't consistently give you an extra card every turn of the game, it often does the trick by supplying an influx of cards at the critical time. The next piece of the puzzle of Taking Turns is well, taking extra turns. Our list has 3 classic extra turn effects, plus 1 imposter doing a decent job. First up is 4 copies of Time Warp, a 5-mana sorcery that says target player takes an extra turn after this one. Tip: always target yourself. If you can think of a modern legal scenario where it's correct to target your opponent, please post it in the comments below, and we'll all politely golf clap for you and then go back to always targeting ourselves. Unlike the other extra turns effects, Time Warp doesn't exile itself. Because we're running 4 Snapcaster mages, we effectively have up to 8 copies of Time Warp, which is great. You can also stack extra turns effects. If, for instance, you miracle to Temporal Mastery, you can cast a Time Warp in the same turn and you'll still get 2 additional turns. I keep a Storm Counter handy when I play turns in person, just in case this situation arises. Next is 4 Temporal Mastery. At 7 mana, it's pricier than Time Warp, but the trade-off is that it also has a miracle cost. This means that if it's the first card you've drawn that turn, and remember, this counts on both your turn and your opponent's turns if you have instant speed card draw like Remand or Cryptic Command, you can cast it for just 2 mana. One oddball tip is to focus on the physical mechanics of piloting this deck. You need to get used to drawing your first card each turn, and this means on your turn and on your opponent's turn, in a way where you can look at it before it touches the rest of the cards in your hand, in case it's a Temporal Mastery that you'd like to miracle. But you shouldn't do that for every card you draw, because you also need to be able to play this deck quickly, or you're going to find yourself going to time. Remember also that a Chalice of the Void on 2 will not counter a Miracle Temporal Mastery, because Chalice cares about the converted mana cost in the top right corner, not the alternate cost you just used. And just so you know, it's called a Meghan when you have a Temporal Mastery in your opening hand, because I am absurdly good at always having a copy in my opening 7. And then my 6. One time I mulliganed to 5 and my hand was 4 Temporal Masteries and a Serum Visions. It was the magic card equivalent of waking up with a horse head in my bed. Then there's just 2 copies of Part the Water Veil. I included these for 2 reasons. I wanted more taking turns effects, and casting 1 for the Awaken cost is a way to quickly close out a game before you run out of cards in library or taking turns effects in your deck. We only have 2 because it's more expensive than Time Warp, and unlike Temporal Mastery, it doesn't have a miracle cost. I'm also likely to board out 1 copy if I'm playing against very aggressive decks and need more cheap spells and fewer expensive ones. Finally, there are 4 copies of Exhaustion, the pseudo extra turn effect I mentioned. Exhaustion says creatures and lands target opponent controls don't untap during his or her next untap step. I once cast an Exhaustion while I still had 2 extra turns queued up, looked my opponent dead in the eye, and said, "Your lands and creatures don't untap if you ever get another turn." Karma is coming for me. Exhaustion varies in effectiveness depending on what deck you're playing against. Versus creature-based decks tapping out for threats and killing you with combat damage, it's often nearly as effective as a Time Warp. Against control decks, it's less effective, and you'll look to board it out. The next piece of the puzzle is counter magic. Taking turns isn't a true control deck. It's not trying to run opponents out of resources before closing out the game. It's just stalling them long enough to combo off. So with that in mind, taking turns doesn't pack a ton of counter magic, but there are 2 key spells with 4 copies of each. Remand is a procrastinator's dream, essentially making your opponent try tomorrow what they were hoping to do today. Cryptic Command is one of the most flexible and powerful spells in Modern, giving you a multitude of ways to not die. A lot of the time you're going to counter a spell and draw a card, but you might also find yourself tapping down a host of lethal attackers when your opponent moves to combat, or even, in a few corner cases, bouncing a Planeswalker that's getting dangerously close to ultimating. There are a lot of ways to die in Modern, but Cryptic Command is like the Swiss Army knife of not dying. Remand and Cryptic Command also both give you a shot at miracling a Temporal Mastery on your opponent's turn, which is a great bonus if you can manage it. More importantly, they're digging you farther into your deck, finding you the combo pieces of more card draw and extra turn spells. Finally, we come to the other stuff. Cards that don't quite fit into any of the categories above, but are nonetheless essential to making the deck work. Serum Visions helps you gather the missing pieces of your game plan, drawing you farther into your deck and putting unneeded cards on the bottom of your deck. It's also a great way to set up a miracle Temporal Mastery. Make sure that when you're scrying Temporal Masteries, you take into account any remands or cryptic commands you plan to cast on your opponent's turn. Snapcaster Mage is another flexible tool in your turn's arsenal, functioning as another copy of any instant or sorcery you've already cast. It can be another Time Warp if you're in the process of comboing off, or another cryptic command to tap your opponent's team and prevent them from attacking for lethal, or another Serum Visions when the pieces you need aren't quite coming together. It's also a way to slowly, agonizingly kill your opponent 2 damage over the course of 7 or 8 turns. Last, we have the lands. The bulk of our mana base is basic islands, 11 of them to be exact, because islands are the best card in Magic. They're beautiful, they're amazing. There's nothing they cannot do, and don't you ever try to tell me otherwise. But we do need a few other lands to make the deck work. 4 Scalding Tarns are often just going to fetch islands, but if we've sideboarded in some of our red cards, they might grab the deck's single mountain or single steam vents. Even in my first game of each match, when I have no red cards to cast, I'll often fetch my single steam vents with my first Scalding Tarn, just to make sure that I won't have to pay 2 life to have it enter untapped if I naturally draw it later in the game and need it that same turn. 4 Sulphur Falls round out the remainder of the mana for our red splash. They're not fetchable, but unless you're seriously unlucky, they're going to enter the battlefield untapped, which is key, as this can be a mana-intensive deck that wants to use all of its mana every turn. That's the reason I've chosen Sulphur Falls over another dual land, like, say, Wandering Fumarole. There's also a single Mikakoro Center of the Sea. This legendary land taps for colorless, but more importantly, you can pay 2 and tap it to have each player draw a card. Mikakoro is sort of a safety net if you don't manage to find an Ancestral or a Dictate, or if something happens to them. Thoughtseize, Abrupt Decay, Chalice of the Void on 0. It's a tough world out there for card draw. And that's it for our main deck. Moving on to our sideboard, we have 15 cards to make sure that anyone trying to have any fun promptly gets that fun taken away from them. There are 2 Thing in the Ice. I board these in for a lot of creature-based matchups, because even if you don't successfully combo off, a single extra turn is often enough to flip your thing into an Awoken Horror and send all of your opponent's creatures back to their hand. It also catches opponents off guard if they boarded out the majority of their removal. There are also 2 Spell Pierce, which I bring in both control matchups and against Merfolk, because they'll have both Ether Vials and a few counterspells out of the sideboard that they're going to try to catch you with. 2 Hurkyl's Recall, her kill affinity. Karma is coming for me. I suppose they're also a card to bring in against Lantern control, but the truth is that if you're playing against Lantern, you've both already lost. It's like the 1983 film War Games, only Matthew Broderick is nowhere in sight. 2 Blood Moon come in against Tron. They're also an option if you're on the Plague versus Grixis or Jund Death's Shadow, since these decks have pretty demanding mana bases. On the draw though, it's likely too slow. 2 Pyroclasm come in against creature swarm decks, especially those like Elves and Affinity. It's a bit of a gamble bringing them in against Merfolk, as Merfolk runs enough Lords to get their creatures quickly out of Pyroclasm range. 2 Sun Droplet are an attempt to not just lose to burn, but I'm sorry to say, you're still just gonna lose to burn. A lot. Sometimes you're going to lose to burn right away. Sometimes you're going to come close to not losing to burn, and then you're gonna lose to it. I'm fairly aggressive about boarding in 2 Gigadrows. It's good against decks attacking with just a creature or 2, like Death's Shadow, and it's good against decks like Tron that want to tap out a lot to cast huge spells in their main phase. If you've boarded it in and you draw it early, don't be afraid to cast it just to tap all of your opponent's lands on their upkeep, essentially depriving them of their turn. And finally, a single Jace, Vryn's Prodigy, comes in against Control as a way to generate card advantage and a potential way to win the game via Jace's ultimate. And that's it for taking turns. I'm so happy that Team Unified Modern pushed me to find another Modern deck I would love playing, because without that push, I would have never found Taking Turns and learned a whole new suite of ways to make my opponents regret ever laying eyes on a copy of Dictative Kruphix. So what are you waiting for? Get out there and play everyone else's turns as though they've always belonged to you. Again, and again, and again, and again. Yes!